They called my stories boring. My own granddaughter said it like a fact, not a cruelty. She was 19 then, all sharp elbows and shining plans, a girl who wore her cleverness like perfume. "Grandma," she laughed, "you always tell the same ones. The winter of the frozen pipes, the teacher with the limp, the soldier who promised to write." I remember how she rolled her eyes, the way young people do when they think time is endless, and memory is an old toy they've outgrown. I was holding her baby blanket that day, the one I had kept folded in a cedar box since she was born. I wanted to tell her about the night I finished it, how the thread snapped twice, and I cried because I thought a broken thread meant bad luck. But I didn't say that. I just folded the blanket again and said, "Maybe they're boring because they're real." She kissed my cheek absently, already halfway out the door, her phone buzzing with messages, her future calling her louder than I ever could. I was 69 then, still teaching part-time, still believing that one day she'd sit with me properly, without hurry, without glancing at the clock. I didn't expect her to love my stories. I just hoped she'd hear them before the edges frayed, before the faces in them blurred into nothing. I grew up in a house where stories were the only furniture that lasted. My mother used to say, "If you don't tell it, it didn't happen." That's how we kept the dead close, by speaking them out loud. But the world Sophie was born into didn't need words to remember. It had photos, phones, proof. She didn't understand that sometimes the truth lives in the pauses, not the pictures. The day she called me boring was ordinary in every way except for how it cut. The kettle whistled too loud. The air smelled faintly of lavender polish and toast. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open, half listening, half typing. I was telling her about my first apartment, the one with the cracked window, and the neighbor who played cello at midnight. "You should write this down," she said without looking up. "For who?" I asked. "For yourself, maybe, or for your generation. Nostalgia sells." That was her word. Sells. I didn't like the taste of it. She spoke about memories the way realtors speak about properties, marketable if polished, valuable if tragic enough. When she left that afternoon, she hugged me lightly, her perfume sweet and temporary. I watched her walk to her car and thought how distance begins in gestures long before geography takes over. That night, I sat by the window with the lights off, watching the reflection of my own face in the glass. Outside, the rain had started again, fine and deliberate. My reflection looked softer, smaller. I wondered when I had begun speaking in past tense, even while I was still alive. People assume old age is a slow erasure, but it happens in sentences, in the small ways the world stops expecting you to matter. You become a season in other people's calendars, pleasant to visit, not meant to stay. It wasn't the first time I'd been dismissed, but it was the first time it came from her. When my husband was alive, he'd listen with half an ear, his mind always elsewhere, bills or weather or television. But Sophie, she had been the one who used to sit cross-legged on the rug, begging, "Tell me again about the bridge." Back then, she believed my stories had secret doors. I remember the first time she asked to record one of them. She was 8. I didn't have a smartphone then, just an old tape recorder. She pressed the red button and held her breath while I spoke about the summer of the river flood, about how I lost my shoes in the current and laughed because I felt suddenly lighter. Years later, that tape vanished somewhere in the clutter of her childhood, or maybe in a box after my husband's funeral. It doesn't matter. What matters is that once she believed in me as a keeper of something worth hearing. Now, I live alone in a small cottage by the sea, the kind of place that doesn't appear on maps, but shows up in dreams. The walls creak with the wind, and the floorboards remember every step I've taken. The mornings are quiet except for the kettle, the gulls, and the soft thud of mail that never brings surprises. I teach once a week at the community center, Memoir for Beginners. The room smells like coffee and fear. My students are mostly women my age, their hands restless, their stories hiding behind recipes and church gossip. I tell them to start with the moment they were silenced. That's where your story begins, I say, though I rarely take my own advice, because when I think of beginnings, I think of endings. The moments that sounded like goodbyes, even when they weren't meant to be. After Sophie called me boring, she came around less. College, she said, then work, then love. Life pulled her forward like a current. I didn't blame her. I was young once too, and I know the hunger for elsewhere. But what she couldn't understand was that stories are not souvenirs. They're proof of survival. Each one is a pulse that says, I was here. I saw this. I mattered, even briefly. I kept telling mine anyway, to no one in particular, maybe to the air. Sometimes the house echoed them back, like a kind friend pretending to listen. People think betrayal is loud, but it often begins with politeness. You don't notice you're being erased until someone compliments the blankness where your face used to be. That's how I felt the day she laughed at my stories. I smiled back because I didn't want to be the heavy weight around her ankle. I wanted her to fly, but I didn't realize she'd need my wings to do it. There's a certain cruelty in youth. It doesn't mean to hurt, but it can't imagine consequences. Sophie didn't hate me. She just didn't need me. And in this world, need is the closest thing to love we recognize. I told myself that maybe she'd remember one day. Maybe she'd look back and find meaning in the dull edges of my tales. I didn't know then how memory could be stolen, dressed in prettier clothes, and sold back to you as fiction. The funny thing about aging is that people think it gives you wisdom. Sometimes it only gives you distance. From that distance, I can see us now, her at the table, impatient fingers tapping, me holding a chipped mug and trying to keep my voice steady. I see how the light fell across the table, how the dust floated between us like tiny visible seconds. She said, "You should let me record some of these for my writing class. Maybe I can make something out of them." I thought she meant to preserve them, to keep me alive on tape when I was gone. I didn't know she meant to edit me out. That afternoon, when she left, the house felt oddly hollow. I washed the mugs, watered the fern, rearranged the books on the shelf as if order could soothe rejection. Outside, the sea kept moving, indifferent and ancient. I envied it, its ability to erase footprints without cruelty. That night, I found the old cassette from her childhood in a drawer. The label had faded, but I could still make out her handwriting. Grandma's River Story. I played it on an old player. My voice sounded younger, steadier. I listened to myself laugh mid-sentence, to her small giggle in the background. We had both been so sure that stories were forever. I cried quietly, not because of what was lost, but because of how easily we give away what should have been guarded. So yes, she called me boring, and I believed her for a while. I stopped telling stories at family dinners. I learned to speak in small, polite phrases, the kind that end quickly so others can take their turn. I watched conversations shrink around me like fabric in hot water. But silence has a way of breeding something stubborn. The longer you live with it, the louder your own heart begins to sound. And mine, though tired, was not done speaking. Now when people ask who I am, I say, I'm a woman made of stories no one wanted to hear. It sounds sad, but it isn't. It's a warning, because stories are patient. They wait, and mine, as it turned out, were only resting. They were gathering strength, waiting for the day they'd be stolen so they could finally be seen. It began, as betrayals often do, with something that looked like love. The year Sophie turned 22, she came back from university with a leather notebook, a borrowed car, and the confidence of someone who believed the world was already half conquered. She called ahead, something she rarely did, and said, "Grandma, can I come by this weekend? I want to talk to you about your stories." I nearly dropped the phone. It had been years since she'd shown more than polite interest. Her voice was warm, quick, too practiced, like someone pitching an idea to a producer rather than speaking to blood. But I didn't care. I baked her favorite lemon squares, washed the curtains, and even took out the good china that hadn't been used since my husband's funeral. When she arrived, I was waiting at the door. She smelled of expensive shampoo and city rain. I hugged her, but she stayed stiff for a second too long before saying, "I can't stay overnight, but I thought we could do a few recordings, for my project." She waved her phone like a journalist flashing credentials. I asked what kind of project, and she smiled that bright, evasive smile that always meant she wanted something but didn't want to say it outright. "It's for my writing course. We're supposed to collect oral histories from older relatives, turn them into narrative essays. It'll be a way to keep your stories alive," she said, almost reverently. I didn't question her. I was too touched, too hungry to be remembered. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where she'd once drawn with crayons, and she positioned her phone between us. "Just talk like you normally would," she said. "Pretend I'm not here." As if love could be observed without being changed. I started hesitantly, describing the first winter after my wedding. The broken furnace, the ice on the inside of the windows, the way my husband and I huddled together beneath layers of blankets, laughing at our own foolish optimism. She nodded, taking notes. Then she asked questions that surprised me. "How did you really feel about him, Grandma? Were you ever in love with anyone else? Did you ever regret staying?" The way she asked, it wasn't curiosity. It was excavation. I answered honestly at first, then carefully, then reluctantly. She was digging for something darker, some tragedy she could shape into meaning. At one point, I said, "Not every life is a confession, dear." She smiled, unbothered, and said, "But that's what makes it literature." By the second recording, I started to feel exposed. She wanted the details that hurt, the parts I had only ever hinted at, the miscarriage in '59, the year my husband drank through Christmas, the long silence between us that stretched like unpainted walls. She asked me to describe how the silence sounded. I told her it was like snow falling on a road where no one drives anymore. She gasped, said it was perfect, and wrote it down. I didn't realize I had just given her a line she would later sell as poetry. Still, part of me was flattered. She kept saying things like, "You have such a natural voice," and "No one writes like this anymore." Her praise was a balm I hadn't known I needed. So when she came again the following weekend with a better recorder, I didn't hesitate. I brewed tea, brushed my hair, and put on a soft blue blouse because she said photographs helped her capture mood. She took pictures of my hands, of the kitchen table, of my old photographs. She asked if she could take the box of letters my husband wrote from the Navy years, just to study them. I let her. I let her take pieces of me in paper and ink, trusting she would bring them back intact. When she left that Sunday evening, she hugged me properly, for the first time in years. "This is going to be something beautiful," she said. I believed her. I even imagined a little family book, something she'd designed for us, our lives stitched together across generations. For weeks afterward, I waited for her updates. When none came, I told myself she was busy editing. I wrote her letters about small things, the neighbor's cat having kittens, the apricot tree finally blooming again, but she didn't reply. I tried not to take it personally. Writers, I told myself, are private creatures. My husband had been that way too, present in body, absent in thought. Months passed. The recordings gathered dust in my memory until one afternoon a letter arrived, not from Sophie, but from my daughter, her mother. Sophie won an award, it said. Her creative nonfiction piece got published in a literary magazine. You'll love it. It's based on your life. I felt a rush of pride before I even turned on the computer to read it. But when I found the article, my breath caught. The title was The Winter Wife. It began with the same furnace story, the same cracked windows, even the same line about snow falling on the forgotten road. But everything else, everything, had been changed. My name was gone. My husband had become an abusive stranger. My child, my daughter, was described as distant, ungrateful, almost cruel. And the woman who told the story, the narrator, was portrayed as a martyr, poetic and pitiful, a woman too simple to understand her own depth until the writer rescued her from obscurity. I read every word twice, feeling my heart shift from wonder to nausea. It wasn't fiction. It was theft wrapped in talent. She had taken my voice, polished it, and claimed it as her discovery. That night, I couldn't sleep. The walls of the house seemed to hum with her words. I saw her in my mind, standing on a stage, reading lines I had whispered in confidence. I imagined her classmates clapping, her professor calling her brilliant, and the idea made something in me close like a fist. I wasn't angry at her ambition. I was angry at the erasure, the way she turned me into a silhouette and herself into the light. For days, I couldn't eat properly. I replayed our conversations, wondering if I'd said too much, if I'd invited this. Maybe I had been foolish to believe in the sanctity of family. Maybe every generation rewrites the last in order to feel original. But this was different. This wasn't reinterpretation. It was consumption. I didn't tell anyone. I folded the magazine printout and tucked it in the drawer where I keep my birth certificate and my husband's medals, the documents of my existence. A strange thought came over me then. In 100 years, someone might read her version and think it was mine. My own truth would vanish like a rumor. That terrified me more than death. Death ends you once. Erasure ends you repeatedly. 2 months later, she called again. "Grandma," she said brightly, "you won't believe it. My piece got shortlisted for a national anthology. The editor said the imagery was hauntingly authentic." I forced a smile she couldn't see and said, "Congratulations, darling. Authenticity does have its uses." She didn't hear the steel under the sweetness. "I'll send you a copy when it's printed," she said. She never did. That was the day the silence between us became permanent. I wanted to ask her why she didn't credit me, why she turned our family's pain into performance. But then I thought, what would she say? That it's art? That truth belongs to whoever can write it better? The next week, I saw her name online again, listed under a new contest. The description of her upcoming book read, "A lyrical exploration of forgotten women told through the eyes of an unnamed matriarch." I stared at the screen for a long time. Unnamed. That was me. Erased not by malice, but by convenience. There's a peculiar humiliation in realizing that your voice has been used to make someone else appear wise. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that she needed this more than I did. But every time I heard her name mentioned, a small bitterness settled behind my ribs. Not jealousy, not even anger, just a hollow space where recognition should have lived. I kept thinking about those tapes she'd made. She never returned them. Perhaps they're sitting in some digital archive now, labeled as source material. My life flattened into data. The last time I saw her, it was by accident. I was at the grocery store, fumbling with a bag of flour, when she walked in, wearing a long camel coat and holding her phone like a passport. She looked older, sleeker, her hair pulled into a perfect knot. When she saw me, surprise flickered across her face, then something like guilt, quickly hidden under politeness. "Grandma, I didn't know you shop here." I told her I'd been shopping here for 30 years. She laughed too loudly, said she'd call soon, that we should catch up. I wanted to tell her I'd already caught up, that I'd read every word of her betrayal. But the words tangled somewhere behind my teeth. I only said, "Take care of your words, Sophie. They have longer memories than people do." She smiled, not understanding, and kissed my cheek before disappearing into the crowd. That evening, I walked home slowly through the rain. The air smelled of wet leaves and salt. I realized then that something irreversible had happened. A private trust had been broken, the kind that doesn't heal even with apology. I was not angry at the theft itself, but at how easily it had been done, how natural it seemed to her generation to take what was lived and turn it into content. It wasn't malice, it was hunger, and I had been the meal. As I reached my porch, I saw the light flickering through the window and thought of that first recording. Her eager face, my voice trembling as I told her about the snow. I remembered the warmth I'd felt that day, the relief of being heard. I hadn't realized I was speaking into a mouth that would later claim the echo as its own. That was the true betrayal, not the publication, not the fame, but the moment I mistook extraction for love. For a long while, I tried to convince myself that what she had done was just enthusiasm, a misunderstanding, born from the arrogance of youth, that maybe she had intended to come back with the book in her hands and say, "This is ours, Grandma," and then sit with me and read it aloud. But weeks became months. Months turned into a quiet year, and nothing came. The world kept speaking her name, but mine was gone, dissolved into adjectives. She had become a promising new voice in contemporary literature, and I had become her ghostwriter by accident of blood. I began seeing her face in articles online, smiling in a way I didn't recognize, standing in front of a bookshelf with her name printed in gold on the spines behind her. The caption under one photo said, "Sophie Harland, the young chronicler of forgotten women." Forgotten women. I wondered if she realized one of them was still alive, still paying her electricity bill, still buying her own groceries, still waking every morning with the same breath that had shaped those sentences. I didn't hate her. I envied the neatness of her world, how artfully she rearranged the truth. I wanted to hate her, but anger is a flame that feeds on closeness, and she had already walked too far away for that. What remained was a slow, heavy ache, like frost under skin. After the article, I started avoiding the bookstore. I couldn't stand seeing her face on the display table, my own memories dressed up in her metaphors. One afternoon, I made the mistake of walking past the window of the local library, and there it was again, a poster announcing her upcoming talk, "The Power of Female Memory." Beneath her name, in smaller letters, in conversation with award-winning author Daniel Corbin. I stared at it until my reflection blurred with hers, the two of us overlapping on the glass like a cruel collage. I remember whispering to myself, "So, this is what legacy looks like when it's stolen." That night, I tore open the drawer where I had hidden her printed article and read it again, line by line, searching for a trace of apology, something human between the words. But she had written herself as the savior and me as an artifact. My life had become her exhibit. There's a certain humiliation in realizing your pain has been reformatted into art. Friends started sending me links with cheerful messages. Look at your talented granddaughter, not knowing they were congratulating the theft of my life. At the church potluck, one of the women from the reading club said, "You must be so proud, Evelyn. She writes about women like you, the quiet ones." I smiled and said, "Yes, she does." But later, in the kitchen, while scraping plates, I felt my chest tighten with something wordless. It wasn't jealousy. It was the despair of being simultaneously seen and erased. They thought her compassion made me visible, but all it did was bury me under her narrative. I became a symbol of endurance, an emblem of generational suffering, a neat box of lessons to make her readers feel enlightened. None of them would ever know that the woman behind those polished lines had burned her fingers on an old stove, had once stayed up all night writing letters to a husband who forgot to answer, had dreamed of a life smaller but truer than the one she'd lived. None of that survived the editing. I thought about calling her, telling her that she could have just asked. But then I remembered the tone of her voice, that last time on the phone, how she said, authenticity, as though authenticity were a commodity, something to be extracted from old women like oil from the ground. I began to understand that what had happened wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a transaction. She had taken what she needed, texture, grief, survival, and left the rest behind. I was the husk, the raw material she no longer needed to visit, and yet, foolishly, I still waited for her, half hoping she'd come knocking one Sunday saying, "I need to record one more story." I had so many left untold. The day I almost ran away from my wedding, the friend I never forgave, the quiet triumph of keeping myself alive after everyone else had stopped trying. But she never came, and slowly, I stopped expecting the sound of her car in the driveway. The house grew quieter that year. I found myself talking less to people, more to objects. My teapot, my window plants, the photograph of my mother on the mantel, they all seemed better listeners than anyone else. I started writing bits of memory on loose paper, not for publication, not even for my children, just to keep them from fading. I thought of it as a kind of insurance against disappearance. I'd read once that even the act of naming something keeps it alive longer. So I named everything I had loved, everything I had lost. I named the streets of my childhood, the faces of the women who taught me to sew, the exact shade of my husband's eyes before they dulled with age. I filled drawers with words, small handwritten proofs of existence, as if paper could testify when people would not. I didn't know then that those papers would one day become my salvation. Around that time, my daughter began mentioning Sophie's success more frequently, almost defensively, as if she sensed my discomfort, but didn't know its cause. "She's really making something of herself, Mom," she'd say on the phone, her voice bright with pride and exhaustion. "You should see her readings, the way people hang on her every word. It's beautiful." I never told her that half of those words had first been whispered in this very kitchen. I didn't want to sound bitter. Bitterness makes people stop listening, and I'd already been ignored enough for one lifetime. Instead, I said, "That's wonderful, dear," and hung up, feeling smaller each time. The first time I tried to read Sophie's book, I stopped halfway through. The stories were familiar but skewed, like reflections in a cracked mirror. She had changed locations, names, even seasons, but I could still hear my own breath behind her sentences. She had stolen not the events, but the rhythm of my remembering, the way I lingered on weather, on smells, on the small details of ordinary suffering. She'd learned that from me. But where my memories had weight, hers had polish. She'd cleaned the dirt off the truth until it shone. People loved it, of course. They called it luminous, unflinching, a tribute to resilience. I wanted to ask them if they knew resilience wasn't poetic when you lived it. It was just survival in dirty shoes. That winter, she came back to town for a book signing. The local paper printed an interview with her where she said, "My grandmother inspired many of the emotional landscapes in my novel. She's always been a storyteller. My name wasn't mentioned, just a vague silhouette of gratitude." When I read that line, something inside me both softened and cracked. It was the smallest acknowledgement, but it came wrapped in distance. She didn't say Evelyn, she said my grandmother, as if the word itself could carry all the affection she didn't know how to give. The article ended with her saying she hoped to continue exploring intergenerational silence. I folded the paper and whispered, "You don't explore silence, darling. You inherit it." The night of her signing, I walked to the bookstore but didn't go inside. Through the window, I saw her standing under bright lights, her hands moving like a conductor's as she spoke. People laughed when she laughed, sighed when she paused. Behind her, on a large poster, her name gleamed beside the book's title. I stood outside in the drizzle, holding my umbrella, and listened through the glass as she read aloud a passage about an old woman who used to tell endless stories until her family grew tired of them. The audience chuckled. Sophie smiled. My throat closed. I wanted to run inside, to shout, "That woman was me." But what would that accomplish? They would look at me the way people look at strangers who interrupt performances, pitying, embarrassed, protective of their illusion. So I stayed outside until the applause ended, and when people began lining up for signatures, I turned and walked home. On the way, I passed a street musician playing an old cello, the sound raw and imperfect. I stopped, dropped a few coins into his case, and listened for a while. The music reminded me of something I used to believe, that beauty doesn't need witnesses to exist. It survives quietly, stubbornly, even when ignored. That thought gave me an odd peace. Maybe I didn't need her validation or the world's acknowledgement. Maybe it was enough to know that what she wrote was born from me, even if the world would never trace it back. Yet, later that night, when I washed my hands and caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror, I saw a woman I didn't quite recognize. My eyes looked hollow, my posture smaller. That was when I understood that being unseen too long reshapes you. You start erasing yourself before others can. Spring came, and with it a strange clarity. I decided I wouldn't read another interview, wouldn't watch another video of her readings. I packed her books into a cardboard box and pushed it to the back of the closet. But the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was thick, heavy, like air before a storm. I began to dream of voices, mine and hers, interwoven, indistinguishable. In the dreams, she was always writing, and I was always explaining myself to no one. I'd wake up sweating, clutching the sheets, and whisper, "It was my story." That refrain became a kind of prayer. It wasn't anger anymore. It was a plea to the universe not to let me vanish completely. One afternoon, a young woman from the community center came to deliver flyers for a new workshop, Memoir Writing for the Overlooked. I laughed at the title, then paused. Something in me stirred, a pulse, faint but insistent. That night, I took out the old notebook where I'd written down fragments of memory and began again, slowly at first, my hand trembling. I didn't write about Sophie or her betrayal. I wrote about the things she hadn't stolen, the smell of my mother's soap, the way the moon looked from my first apartment, the feel of my husband's hand when he was still kind. And as I wrote, I realized the cruelest part of her theft wasn't what she had taken, but what she had missed. She had taken the pain but left behind the life. She had captured the sorrow, but not the endurance. That difference, small and enormous at once, became my secret weapon. I kept writing long after midnight, the house dark except for the lamp by my chair, and for the first time in years, I felt like I existed again, fully, beyond her words. It happened one morning in late autumn, when the sea outside my window had turned the color of pewter, and the gulls were flying low, their wings heavy with rain. I had been sitting at my small kitchen table, sorting through old papers, when a notice slipped out from between two utility bills, an invitation to a local reading event, Voices of Memory, Stories from the Coast. I almost threw it away, but then I saw the name of the organizer, an old librarian I knew from years back, the one who had once told me that forgotten people only stay forgotten if they stop talking. I hesitated, staring at the paper until the print blurred. My first thought was that I had nothing to say that wasn't already stolen, but my second thought came quieter and firmer. Maybe that was exactly why I needed to speak. For weeks I had been writing privately, filling notebooks with pieces of my life that no one had ever asked for. The scent of damp laundry in winter, the feel of the small scar on my left palm, the laughter that followed me down the school corridor when I tried to teach poetry to children who thought rhyme was a punishment. Those details, insignificant to anyone else, became proof of my ownership. The more I wrote, the clearer my mind became, as though every sentence cleaned the fog from the window of my own existence. I didn't plan to show them to anyone. I was writing because the silence had grown too thick to breathe in. But when I saw that invitation, something in me shifted. Maybe, I thought, there are others like me, voices borrowed, stories bent, still waiting to be heard. So I folded the paper neatly and placed it beside my teacup. That afternoon, I walked into town. The air smelled of seaweed and wood smoke, the kind of scent that makes the past seem near. The community hall was small and tired, with chipped paint on the windowsills and chairs that creaked when you sat down. The event hadn't started yet, and a few early arrivals milled around the coffee table, shyly avoiding one another's eyes. I recognized that shyness. It was the look of people who had spent their lives being told their experiences weren't interesting enough to keep. I almost turned back, but a woman about my age stopped me at the door. She wore a red scarf and had the kind of smile that expects nothing. "You're here for the readings?" she asked. I nodded, and she handed me a folded program. "If you've got something to share, there's time at the end. It's informal. No judgment." She said it so gently that I found myself sitting down before I could think of a reason not to. The readings began modestly. A fisherman's widow speaking about storms, a retired nurse describing the sound of hospital corridors at night, a man who had lost his brother in Vietnam reading a letter he'd never sent. Their words were rough and unpolished, but there was truth in every syllable. When my turn came, my heart hammered so hard I could hear it in my ears. I hadn't planned to speak, but when the host asked if anyone else wished to read, my hand lifted almost without my permission. I stood, knees trembling, and began to read from one of my notebooks. My voice wavered at first, but steadied as I went on. I read about my mother's kitchen, about the way her stories stitched our evenings together, about the loneliness that came after she died, and how silence became my inheritance. The room was utterly still. When I finished, no one clapped right away. They just breathed with me. Then softly, the applause began. Gentle, respectful, the kind that doesn't celebrate performance but recognition. It was small, but it filled a space in me I hadn't known was empty. Afterward, a woman approached me, younger than Sophie, with ink-stained fingers and tired eyes. "Your story," she said. It sounded like my grandmother's. I smiled and told her that maybe all grandmothers carry the same ghosts. She asked if I had more written, and when I said yes, she told me she worked with a small local press that published personal essays. I felt a flicker of something between disbelief and hope. She handed me a card. "We're always looking for real voices," she said, and I laughed at the irony. For a moment, I wanted to tell her that my voice had already been used, that it was hardly real anymore, but instead, I tucked the card into my pocket. That night, I dreamed of my younger self walking along the beach, calling my name into the wind just to hear the echo return. In the days that followed, I began to rewrite everything I'd once told Sophie, but this time I wrote for myself. I wrote the truth she'd ignored, the parts she'd softened to make me tragic. I described the arguments with my husband, not as melodrama, but as weary rituals of two people afraid of being alone. I wrote about my failures as a mother, my envy of women who had lived louder lives, my guilt over the things I hadn't dared to want. Every page was a reclamation, a small act of defiance. I stopped editing for grace and wrote instead for accuracy, because real life, I realized, doesn't need to be beautiful to matter. Sometimes I wondered what Sophie would think if she read these drafts. Would she recognize herself in the margins? Would she see that she hadn't invented me, only misplaced me? I doubted it. People who build stories out of others rarely look back to see what they've taken. But I imagined her face anyway, imagined her reading the line where I wrote. She thought she was chronicling silence, but she was only echoing her own reflection. The thought gave me strange comfort. When winter deepened, I mailed 3 of my essays to the woman from the reading, more out of curiosity than ambition. I didn't expect to hear back, but 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived with her name on the corner. My hand shook as I opened it. Inside was a letter written in blue ink. "Your voice carries an honesty we rarely see. We'd be honored to include your pieces in our next issue." I read the sentence 3 times before it sank in. It wasn't fame, it wasn't money, but it was acknowledgement, the real kind, the one that calls you by your name. For the first time in years, I felt visible. I brewed tea and sat by the window, watching the sea darken into evening. Somewhere beyond that horizon, Sophie was probably sitting under bright lights, being interviewed, praised for her empathy. I imagined her speaking eloquently about the power of stories to heal. And maybe she was right. Stories could heal, even stolen ones, but not in the way she believed. Healing doesn't come from applause. It comes from reclaiming the voice that was taken. When the journal arrived a month later, I ran my fingers over the printed page. The title of my essay was "The Taste of Dust." Beneath it, in clean black type, my name, Evelyn Hart. My name, not someone's grandmother, not an unnamed matriarch, not a silhouette. I stared at those letters until they blurred, then pressed my palm against them as though to prove they were real. That night, I slept without dreams for the first time in years. But peace, I learned, is never permanent. The very next day, a former student of mine called. "Mrs. Hart," she said breathlessly, "did you know there's a book review in the Gazette comparing your essay to your granddaughter's work? They said your piece has a similar emotional DNA, but with more authenticity." I froze, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "They mentioned me by name?" I asked. "Yes. They said your essay feels like the original draft of her world." The phrase stung and soothed all at once. Original draft. I thanked her and hung up, my heart pounding. Part of me feared Sophie would see it, that she'd feel exposed, perhaps even angry. But another part of me, a quieter, braver part, hoped she would. Because maybe then she would know that I was still here, that her story hadn't replaced me after all. Over the next weeks, more letters arrived from readers, women mostly, some young, some my age, writing that they saw themselves in my words. One woman confessed that she had hidden her own journals for years because her daughter called them self-indulgent. Another said she had been collecting her grandmother's recipes and now realized they were actually coded memoirs. I answered every letter carefully, with gratitude and a kind of awe. It felt strange to be seen not as material, but as a mirror. I began to understand that my silence had never protected anyone. It had only made the theft easier. By speaking, I wasn't competing with Sophie. I was simply reminding the world that I existed outside her narrative. One evening, I attended another reading at the community hall. The room was fuller this time, faces familiar from last month. When it was my turn, I read a new piece called Inheritance of Quiet, about how women in my family had been taught to keep peace at the expense of truth. The final line came to me as I read it aloud. I mistook being unremembered for being safe. When I finished, there was a long silence, then a murmur of applause that swelled gently. The woman with the red scarf came up afterward and said, "You should keep writing. It's never too late to claim authorship of your own life." I walked home slowly under a bruised sky, the streetlights flickering on one by one. For the first time, I didn't feel like a ghost trailing behind someone else's success. I felt like a woman mid-sentence, still speaking, still unfolding. That night, as I sat by the window, I realized something profound. Sophie had taken my stories, yes, but she hadn't taken my memory. The raw material of truth still belonged to me, unedited, unrefined, alive in the rhythm of my own breathing. And as long as I remembered, as long as I kept writing, I could outlive her version. I wasn't erasing her work or seeking revenge. I was rewriting myself into the world she had redrawn without permission. The rain began to fall, steady and insistent, tapping against the glass like an old friend reminding me that sound itself is proof of presence. I closed my notebook, smiled into the dark, and whispered, "I'm still here." The peace I found in those months did not last long. The moment I began to breathe freely again, the past, reshaped, renamed, and published, returned with its old insistence. It began quietly, the way rot begins in wood, hidden beneath polish. One morning, I went to fetch my mail and saw a glossy magazine resting in the box, its cover a familiar face, Sophie, smiling with her careful, deliberate charm, her head tilted slightly, as if listening to applause that only she could hear. The headline beneath her photograph read, "The Voice of Generations, Sophie Harland on Family Fiction and the Women Who Made Her." For a second, my knees felt weak, and I had to steady myself against the fence. I brought it inside, brewed tea I didn't want, and opened the pages with the slow dread of someone re-entering a house that used to be hers, but now belongs to someone else. The interview began innocently enough. Talk of inspiration, process, heritage of storytelling, but then came the sentences that burned. "My grandmother was the original storyteller," she said. "She gave me the bones of everything, though of course I had to rebuild the flesh." The interviewer laughed and wrote that Sophie had rescued the untold from the silence of old age. rescued. As if I were some artifact she had dug from the dust, as if my living voice had been a relic until she translated it into something marketable. I sat at the table and read it twice. Her words were not malicious, but they carried the calm cruelty of someone who does not think she has done wrong. She spoke about me as if I were a ghost already gone, someone she could shape freely now that I was conveniently absent. My hands trembled as I turned the pages. There was even a photograph of her sitting in a sunlit studio. Behind her, a framed print of a woman's hands sewing, a clear echo of the picture she once took of mine years ago. The caption read, "The artist at work, stitching memory into narrative." I wanted to tear the page, but I didn't. Instead, I folded the magazine neatly, like a letter I wasn't yet ready to answer, and placed it beside my typewriter. For the first time in years, I felt the old sharpness of rage, not youthful, but clean and clarifying. It wasn't just about being unseen anymore. It was about being used. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sea outside was roaring, the wind beating the shutters as though echoing my thoughts. I kept seeing her smile, practiced and self-assured, and the line in the article where she said, "I come from a lineage of women who suffered beautifully." That word, beautifully, was unbearable. Suffering was never beautiful. It was tedious, humiliating, often absurd. It smelled of soap and salt and cheap coffee and mornings where you kept breathing simply because you didn't know what else to do. There was nothing beautiful about it, and yet she had packaged it like a perfume. I lay in bed until dawn, the anger moving through me like a tide that refused to retreat. The next morning, I wrote her a letter. It was calm, deliberate, composed like a lesson. I wrote that I had read her interview, that I was proud of her success, but that I needed her to understand something. Stories are not heirlooms to be taken. They are lives, still breathing inside those who lived them. I told her that her words, while flattering, had erased me in the same gesture that praised me. I ended it simply. "You took my life and forgot to leave me in it. I sealed it and sent it by registered mail, because some words need to arrive with proof." When I posted it, I felt an odd lightness, as though I had finally released something I'd been carrying too long. 2 weeks later, a package arrived. Inside was a hardcover copy of her latest book, The Quiet Season, the same title that had appeared in the article. Tucked between the first pages was a handwritten note. "Dear Grandma, I hope you see yourself in it. It's my tribute to you. Love, Sophie." There was no mention of my letter, no acknowledgement of the wound, only this smooth gesture of affection, sealed in practiced handwriting. I stared at it for a long time, then opened the book. The dedication read, "For E.H., who taught me how silence sounds." My initials, my erasure disguised as gratitude. I began to read. Every line felt like walking through a distorted version of my life, where everything familiar had been rearranged to fit a story more tragic, more consumable. The girl who resembled me was fragile and pitiful, a creature of nostalgia, the kind readers could cry for and then forget. My husband was rewritten as a tyrant, my daughter as cold and distant. I had been transformed into a symbol, a fable, not a person. By the time I reached the final chapter, my hands were shaking. The last line read, "Her grandmother's voice faded into the waves, leaving behind only echoes." I closed the book and laughed, a dry, bitter sound that startled even me. So this was how she wanted me, faded, finished, swallowed by metaphor. That evening, my daughter called. She had read the book and was ecstatic. "Mom, isn't it wonderful? Sophie said the story's based on us. You should be so proud." I bit my tongue until I tasted blood. How do you explain theft to someone who believes it's an inheritance? How do you tell your own child that she's celebrating your disappearance? I said only, It's well written. After we hung up, I went into the garden and sat among the withered lavender bushes. The air smelled of damp earth and endings. For the first time, I let myself imagine what it would mean to be forgotten entirely, to become only the raw material of someone else's triumph. The thought frightened me enough to make me move. The next week, I took my own manuscript, the essays I had written for the small journal, and the new ones I had kept private, and I sent them to a national contest for unpublished memoirs. I didn't expect to win. I only wanted a record of my existence beyond Sophie's retelling. The form asked for a title, and without thinking, I typed, "The Stories You Ignored." It felt like a warning disguised as a whisper. When I sealed the envelope, I felt the faint tremor of hope, fragile but alive. Months passed. Life went on in its slow rhythm. Tea, letters, the sound of waves, the quiet company of my own persistence. Then one morning I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was warm, professional, curious. "Mrs. Hart, this is Dana Lewis from the Literary Review. I wanted to congratulate you. Your manuscript was shortlisted for the annual Memoir Prize. It's beautiful work." For a moment I couldn't speak. When I finally did, my voice came out thin, almost disbelieving. "Are you sure you have the right person?" She laughed gently. "Quite sure. We'll be featuring an excerpt next month. The piece about the sewing and the silence. It's extraordinary." I thanked her, though the words felt clumsy in my mouth. After I hung up, I sat in the stillness of my kitchen, the sunlight creeping across the floor, and thought, I am real again. But with recognition came attention, and attention has a way of stirring old shadows. A week later, a friend sent me an email. "Did you see this?" she wrote, attaching a link. It was a blog post by a critic comparing my memoir excerpt to Sophie's novel. The headline read, "When Inspiration Circles Back, a Granddaughter's Fiction and a Grandmother's Truth." The article was well-meaning but incendiary. The writer praised both of us, calling Sophie a visionary who found her voice through inheritance, and me a living archive reclaiming authorship. The tone was reverent, but the effect was explosive. Within days, literary gossip sites picked it up. Commenters began speculating about our relationship. Was it collaboration or conflict? Had Sophie stolen from me? Was my memoir an act of revenge? Each sentence felt like a spotlight I had never asked for. Then the phone started ringing. A journalist wanted a statement. Another wanted to schedule an interview about artistic lineage and ethical storytelling. I refused them all. But Sophie didn't. A week later, she appeared on television, her hair flawless, her tone poised. When asked about the controversy, she smiled serenely. "My grandmother and I share a creative bond," she said. "She's always encouraged me to explore our family's history through art. I see her new work as a dialogue with mine, not a conflict." Dialogue. The word was galling. We hadn't spoken in over a year. I watched the interview in silence, noting how smoothly she performed sincerity, how she spoke of me as if I were already gone. The next day, I found an envelope in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single note, written in Sophie's handwriting. "Grandma, please don't let them make this ugly. I love you." I crumpled it, then smoothed it out again, unable to decide whether it was cruelty or cowardice, maybe both. I realized then that she wasn't afraid of hurting me. She was afraid of tarnishing her image of being a loving granddaughter. I was a mirror she needed to stay clean. That evening, my phone rang again, but this time it was the editor from the literary journal. "Evelyn, there's something you should know," she said. "Sophie's publisher reached out. They're asking if your memoir might have borrowed from her novel." They're implying, well, that you may have reused some of her language. For a long time, I couldn't speak. Then I laughed, a deep, astonished laugh that startled the editor. She's accusing me of plagiarism? I asked. After everything she took from me? The editor sighed. It's politics, Evelyn. Don't worry. We know the truth. But you should be prepared. They might push for a retraction. When I hung up, I sat perfectly still. My anger was gone, replaced by a cold clarity. I had expected her to ignore me, to diminish me, but not to attack. That changed everything. The next morning, I printed out every letter I had sent her, every photo she had taken, every note in her handwriting. I placed them neatly in a folder labeled Proof. Then I went to my desk, opened my notebook, and began to write. Not a letter this time, but a full account. Not for her, not even for the world, but for myself. I wrote every truth she had altered, every silence she had misnamed. I wrote until my fingers cramped, until the words spilled faster than I could shape them. I wasn't trying to defend myself. I was trying to preserve what remained of me before she could rewrite it again. When I finished, I looked at the clock. The day had turned to night without me noticing. I stood, stretched my aching back, and went to the window. The sea was calm, reflecting the pale slice of moonlight. I thought of Sophie, somewhere in a bright apartment, surrounded by her books, still convinced that she had done nothing wrong. I whispered into the glass, "You can't steal a life and then call it love." My voice surprised me. It was steady, sure, unbroken. For the first time, I didn't feel invisible or small. I felt immense, rooted, dangerous in my truth. The storm between us wasn't over. I knew that. But I also knew this. She had taken my words once, and now I had taken them back, every one of them, sharpened by time and loss. And this time, I would not be silent. The confrontation, when it finally came, did not happen in some grand hall or courtroom, though I had imagined both. It came, as truth often does, quietly and without ceremony, on a gray afternoon that smelled of sea salt and wet leaves. The phone rang first. A young producer from a national radio program said they were preparing an episode about family narratives and ownership of memory. They wanted both me and Sophie to appear, separately, she assured me, to explore the complexity of shared storytelling. I almost said no, but something in the producer's tone, the assumption that my silence would be the graceful choice, the expectation that I would once again yield the floor to youth and polish, made me pause. "I'll do it," I said. When I hung up, the air in the room felt electric, as if every word I had ever swallowed had risen from the floorboards to listen. In the days that followed, I prepared not a speech, but a calmness. I reread my own essays, not to memorize them, but to remind myself that my story now existed in print, permanent and unborrowed. I reread her book too, this time without anger, as if studying the anatomy of a theft. It was all there, the rhythm of my sentences, the details of my house, the cadence of my pauses. Yet reading it now, I saw something new, the emptiness where feeling should have been. She had taken my skeleton, but none of my marrow. I realized then that no matter how widely she was read, she would never have what I had lived. You cannot inherit breath. That realization steadied me more than any argument ever could. The day of the recording was cold, the kind of day that makes the world smell like tin and smoke. They asked me to come to a small studio in the city. It had been years since I'd traveled that far alone, but I packed my notebook and a thermos of tea and took the early train. Through the window, the countryside slid by, wet fields and tired barns, all the colors of rust and surrender. I thought about how long it had taken me to arrive at this moment. How many times I'd chosen silence over confrontation because I believed silence was dignity. But dignity, I had learned, is not the absence of conflict. It is the refusal to vanish when conflict arrives. The studio was smaller than I expected, the walls lined with gray foam panels that looked like muted echoes. The host, a kind woman with 2 bright eyes, greeted me softly, almost reverently. "We're honored to have you, Evelyn," she said, guiding me to a chair with a microphone curved in front like a flower stem. "Sophie recorded her segment yesterday," she added carefully. "She spoke about your influence, about how your stories shaped her art." I smiled without comment, aware of how easily flattery disguises trespass. She adjusted my headphones, explained how the conversation would flow, and then we began. At first, the questions were gentle. They asked about my childhood, my first memory of storytelling, the way my mother used to braid her hair while speaking of lost cousins and impossible loves. I answered slowly, letting the words settle before sending them out. My voice, older now, sounded like it came from another century, but it didn't tremble. Then the host asked the question we were all waiting for. "Evelyn, there's been much discussion about how your granddaughter's work mirrors your life. How do you feel about her using your stories as inspiration?" The room seemed to tighten. I could hear the low hum of the recording equipment, the whisper of my own breath in the headset. I said, "Stories don't belong to anyone who doesn't live them. They can be retold, yes, reimagined, but there's a difference between inheritance and extraction. My granddaughter didn't take my stories. She took my voice, and that's a harder thing to forgive." The host said nothing for a moment, perhaps expecting bitterness, but I continued before she could interrupt. "I'm not angry at her anymore. Anger is still a kind of attention, and she's had enough of mine. I just want to remind anyone listening that when you borrow someone's truth, you owe them their name." The host hesitated, then said softly, "She told us she sees her work as a tribute." I smiled at that. "Tributes are for the dead," I said, "and I'm still here." The silence that followed was long and raw. Even the machines seemed to pause. When the interview ended, the host reached for my hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "That was remarkable." I only nodded. Outside, the sky had darkened to the color of old iron. I felt light, emptied and filled at once. 2 days later, the episode aired. I didn't plan to listen, but the radio was already on in the kitchen when my neighbor came by. "You're on!" she shouted from the doorway. I stood there frozen as my voice filled the room, steady and unhurried, carrying across the static. When the program ended, there was a long pause, then the sound of applause, recorded, distant, yet strangely intimate. My neighbor looked at me with shining eyes. "You spoke for all of us," she said. I didn't know who us was, but I felt the truth of it in her tone. That evening, my phone rang again. I knew it was her before I picked up. Her voice was small, cautious, stripped of its usual assurance. "Grandma," she said, "I heard the interview. I waited. I didn't mean to hurt you," she continued. "You always said stories were meant to live on. I just wanted to give them life." I took a breath, slow and deep, feeling the weight of years settle in my lungs. "You didn't give them life, Sophie. You borrowed mine because you thought it was over." She didn't answer right away. Then, almost a whisper, "I thought I was honoring you." "No," I said gently, "you were replacing me." There was a silence then, not empty but full, like a room holding its breath. Finally, she said, I don't know how to fix it. I wanted to tell her that some things aren't fixed, they're faced. Instead, I said, start by listening. The line went quiet again. I thought she had hung up, but then she said, I'm listening now. Her voice cracked on the word, and something in me softened. Not forgiveness yet, but the opening where it might one day live. A week later, a letter arrived from her. No flowers, no theatrics, just her handwriting, slanted, rushed, vulnerable. She wrote that she had listened to the recording 3 times, and that for the first time, she understood the difference between telling someone's story and letting them tell it themselves. I can't undo what's been published, she wrote, but I can stop pretending it was mine to shape. At the bottom of the page, she added one line that made me sit down. I want your book to be reissued with your voice beside mine, your essays, your truth, your name. I read it twice, uncertain whether it was guilt or grace, maybe both. I didn't answer right away. I needed to feel the offer in my hands before deciding. A week later, an editor from her publishing house called to confirm. Sophie had insisted that my collection be published under their imprint, that my name appear first. I agreed, but only under one condition, that the introduction be written by me, not by her. Of course, the editor said, relief audible in her tone. What will you call it? I thought for a long time, then said, The Voice That Remained. When the book came out months later, it was modest. A soft cover, cream-colored, no photograph on the front, just the title embossed in gray. Inside, my introduction began simply. For years, I mistook silence for peace. But peace, without recognition, is just another form of disappearance. These are the stories I lived, not the stories written about me. Below that, Sophie's novel was listed as a companion piece, not a source. I held the finished copy in my hands and felt something unnameable, a mix of vindication and sorrow. The girl I had once cradled in my arms had taken my voice, and now, unknowingly, had given it back. That night, I sat by the sea. The tide was coming in, slow and deliberate, erasing the footprints from the sand. I thought of Sophie somewhere far away, maybe watching the same moon, maybe wondering if I had forgiven her. I hadn't, not entirely, but I no longer needed to. Forgiveness, I realized, was just another form of permission, and I had already reclaimed everything that mattered. The waves reached my feet, cold and alive. I whispered into the wind, You tried to bury me in your story, Sophie, but I was the soil, not the seed. The sea didn't answer, but it didn't need to. For the first time, the silence felt like mine. I am an old woman now, and my days have become gentle in their repetition. But there is a new steadiness inside them that was not there before, a kind of quiet dignity that feels neither bitter nor triumphant. The scandal, if that is what it was, passed the way all noise eventually passes, absorbed by newer voices, brighter faces, younger hungers. The world moved on, as it always does, and the 2 books, hers and mine, settled into their separate shelves, occasionally mentioned together, but no longer argued over. Sometimes people write to me, not many, just enough to remind me that the words reach someone. They say things like, Your stories made me call my grandmother, or I started writing again after reading your essay. I keep the letters in a small wooden box on my desk, and when I open it, the faint smell of paper and ink rises like proof that I have lived more than once. I don't reread them often. Knowing they exist is enough. Sophie and I speak occasionally now, not often and not easily, but with something that resembles tenderness, or maybe just exhaustion. There are still subjects we step around, but there is also a strange honesty that wasn't possible before everything broke. The last time we met, she came to the cottage unannounced. It was spring, and the sea was calm, the color of smoke after rain. She brought tulips, still wrapped in their paper, and a small recorder that she placed on the table without turning on. "I don't need to record anymore," she said. "I just wanted to hear you talk." For a moment, I almost laughed. Then I poured her tea, and we sat for hours, speaking about ordinary things, her teaching job, my garden, the stubborn damp that keeps returning to the windowsills. There was no apology, not really, but there was something quieter, something truer, a willingness to sit in the same room without either of us pretending the past hadn't happened. When she left, she hugged me longer than she used to. As she walked down the path, I noticed the recorder still on the table, untouched. I didn't remind her. It felt right that she should forget it. The house has grown smaller around me, or maybe I've grown larger within it. The walls that once felt like barriers now feel like witnesses. Every shelf holds a fragment of my life, a photograph of my mother in her kitchen, the needle case my husband bought me when we were newly married, the typewriter I used to draft my first essays. I used to be afraid of outliving my own relevance, but now I understand that relevance is only another word for noise. What matters is endurance, the quiet persistence of memory. My voice, once dismissed as boring, has outlasted the people who said it. That thought comforts me more than applause ever could. Sometimes, when the light falls a certain way, I reread the introduction to my book. The pages have softened at the corners from handling, and the ink has begun to fade, but the words still hold. For every woman whose voice was borrowed without being heard, I wrote. We're done whispering. I didn't mean it as a declaration of war. I meant it as a prayer. I meant it for the women who taught me silence, for the ones who were rewritten, for the ones who still think their stories are too small to matter. I meant it for Sophie, too, though she doesn't know that. If she learns nothing else from me, I hope she learns that truth isn't ownership, it's endurance. The sea has become my companion. I walk down to it every morning, even when my knees protest. I like to stand where the water meets the sand and feel the tide pulling lightly at my shoes. The sound is constant, patient, never hurried. I used to think waves were erasure, but now I understand their continuation, each one returning, reshaping the shore without destroying it. That is what life is too. Not the preservation of one version, but the slow, merciful revision of it. We are all rewritten by time, but only some of us get to hold the pen. A few months ago, a young woman from the university came to interview me for her thesis on female memory in late-life writing. She had read both my book and Sophie's, and she spoke about them with academic precision, using words like intertextuality and autobiographical reclamation. I smiled and nodded. When she finished her questions, she asked, "Do you ever worry that your granddaughter's version will outlive yours?" I looked at her, so young, so sure that legacy is measured by who is quoted more often, and said, "No, dear, we outlive our versions by living long enough to tell them ourselves." She wrote that down in her notebook as if it were wisdom, but really, it was just survival said beautifully. The night after her visit, I dreamed of my mother for the first time in years. She was standing by the stove stirring soup, humming a tune I'd almost forgotten. In the dream, I told her everything, the theft, the anger, the reclamation, and she listened without surprise, as if she had always known it would happen. When I finished, she said, "Child, every story gets told twice, the first time by the one who lived it, the second by the one who learned." Then she kissed my forehead and turned back to her pot. I woke up with tears on my face, but no sadness, only a strange, full calm. Now, in the evenings, I sit by the window and watch the horizon fade into violet. The radio sometimes plays old jazz, and I leave it on for company. The house hums softly, the sea answers beyond it, and I feel something like peace. I know Sophie is still writing. Her name appears now and then in literary circles, attached to new projects, new accolades. I don't follow her career closely, but when I do see her name, I no longer flinch. She will write her stories, and I will keep mine. Between us lies the quiet truth that both exist, and that is enough. Perhaps one day she'll read these words and recognize the generosity inside them. Perhaps not. It no longer matters. I've learned that endings aren't symmetrical. They don't arrive with justice neatly distributed or understanding perfectly achieved. They come as acceptance, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. My life feels smaller now in its geography, but wider in its echo. I am no longer afraid of fading. I know that even if my words vanish, the sound they made while living will linger somewhere, on a shelf, in a letter, in the air between the waves. I think of all the women who once believed themselves unremarkable, and I wish I could tell them that even the quietest lives can reverberate if you speak them aloud. Sometimes I imagine Sophie years from now, sitting by her own window, perhaps telling her granddaughter about the grandmother who wouldn't disappear. Maybe she'll get some of it wrong again. Maybe that's inevitable. But I like to think that somewhere in her version, she will say, "She taught me what a story really is." That would be enough of an afterlife for me. I don't need apology. I don't even need remembrance. I only need continuity, the steady pulse of words moving forward, carrying fragments of truth through time. Tonight, as I close my notebook, I hear the tide rising higher than usual, the waves drumming softly against the rocks. I whisper a small goodbye, not to Sophie, not to the past, but to the part of myself that waited too long for permission to speak. I no longer need it. My story is told, my voice my own, and the silence that follows it is kind.